a long way back, we started asking questions and looking at who we are as a church as a starting point. And then we started asking, well, where do these who we are answers lead us to as a church? Like, what are we supposed to be doing? Who are we supposed to be? What is this place supposed to look like? And one of those questions that came up in that process is that we are a diverse group of people. It's always been that way, in one form or another. In part, diverse in our theology or in our tradition and backgrounds and stuff like that, and where we come from. Which is exciting because what it does and what we're trying to do, what it does is it brings a collection of voices. Actually, this is worse than I thought it was going to be. Sherry, can you try to turn down this light? I think it's, can we just turn it off? I don't know which number it is. Not that one, but it can stay off. Well, that's okay. Yeah. That one. So much better. Where was I? Diverse. We're a diverse group. And what's beautiful about that is that we get to ask questions of each other and discuss where we come from and what we think on different issues and different theological points. And we get to read the text together in study on this place. We have someone at the communion table that has, we have different, let me say it this way, we have different people at the communion table every single week, which allows for that diversity to be part of our worship practice. And as we explore God together, we get to dive into some of those things as a community, and it makes us stronger. It makes us, it brings out the passion in who we are and what we're doing and how we read the text and things like that. This morning, I want to move us into a very general and specific direction as we move forward. But what I want us to do is to talk about the diversity that we see and the inclusiveness that we see in the story of Jesus. A few weeks ago, we looked at Mark and Mark's amazing storytelling. And one of the things that Mark does is he pulls in just everything that's going on. It's this fast-paced environment. Everybody, and this is what's fascinating about Mark, everybody that thinks they're the in crowd, turns out to be the out crowd. And everybody that is supposed to be the outsiders turns out to be the insiders. And Mark has this masterful way of saying, man, you think you get it, but you don't. In fact, there's one moment where Mark says, Jesus is speaking to the disciples, and Mark's version of the story goes, you have no faith. Have you no faith? And in Matthew, when Matthew tells the same story, he says, you have little faith. And when Luke tells the story, Luke says that the disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith. All the same story, and you see the distinction that's happening and the difference of perspective that these gospel writers are telling about the story of Jesus. And in Mark's story, you think you know what you're doing and you don't. And it's this beautiful way of turning things upside down and all of this conversation about who's in and who's out, who gets it and who doesn't. Luke, on the other hand, has this beautiful way of addressing, and not that Mark does this in his own way, but Luke has this way of identifying those people that are on the outskirts of society, that are supposed to be the outsiders, and showing Jesus compassion and love for them. And so I just want to tell a few of those stories this morning as we look at the story of Jesus, as we think about our own community and what we're trying to do as a church. A And we'll open up to Luke chapter 5 as we sort of begin this story. I didn't tell you much about where we're going. That was difficult, wasn't it? So we're in chapter 5, verse 12. And Jesus has just called his first disciples. So one of the first things he's going to do, now Luke tells a whole lot of things ahead of this story, but one of the first things he's going to do after he starts calling disciples is introduce this concept of Jesus really stepping outside of what's normal and acceptable in terms of who's in and who's out. And verse 12 begins, once when he was in these cities, there was a man covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. Going against all social and ritual and religious standards, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. And he said, I do choose, be made clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he ordered him to tell no one. Now, leprosy was viewed as, we've heard probably many of you this story before. Leprosy was viewed as these were the untouchables. Literally, if you are outcast from your community, you are on the edge of the city or the town that you live in with other lepers, you have to, we've had lots of ways to mark people that are outsiders in our communities and societies and stuff. You had to announce your presence when you were coming up to cross paths with someone. Unclean, unclean, unclean. That's not a good introduction if you're trying to make new friends. And Jesus walks, and so what happens is, okay, so there's this thing of they're diseased, that they have a sickness that is that is undesirable. It looks bad. People don't want to be around you. You've been ostracized outside of your community. Also, because of this, you have a designation of ritual impurity in terms of the Jewish perspective, Jewish faith. And so not only, if you are a holy man like Jesus, not only is this person undesirable by society standards, you are not to touch anyone that is unclean, and in doing so, you make yourself unclean. And so when Jesus literally reaches out to care and love for this man, touching is a way to say, I love you. You are a child of God, and I am here with you, and we are in this together. And Jesus makes himself unclean in the process. This is the moment that we begin this ministry when he has set out to say, okay, I'm calling some disciples. Now we're going to tell the story of Jesus, including people that by all societal standards were supposed to be excluded. You don't touch, you don't look at, you don't go near, you turn the other direction. And certainly if you are to be holy as God is holy, you are not to be made unclean by this person who is unclean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. In the Hebrew text, stretched out a hand often has an implication of God reaching into the world and doing something, sometimes militarily, but often miraculously. And that's what happens here. Stretched out his hand and touched him. I do choose, be made clean. Go and tell no one. Go show yourself to the priest. Now that you are clean, the priest is the only one that can right you in this society and allow you to return and make an offering. The next thing he does is he heals a paralytic. And we have a conversation about that. And then he moves on to Levi. And these are just back to back to back because Luke is going to just pound this story about Jesus who is radically inviting people to the table that don't belong to the table. And quite literally, he comes to Levi. After this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." He got up, left everything, and followed him. So tax collectors, different than someone with leprosy, are outsiders in their own community. They're outsiders because they are seen as the voice and image of Caesar. They are seen as the one collecting, naturally, funds on behalf of the state. Often in these roles, you would find somebody in the community. Say you would find somebody living in the Jewish community that's willing to do that role and go from individual to individual that is one of their own to go and collect those taxes. So you have someone who is seen as both an outsider for rejecting their own community, but also as one that often skims off the top. We're just not supposed to like these guys. The Gospels make this very clear. Tax collectors are bad people. And here, Jesus says, "Follow me." And one of his 12 disciples is this tax collector. And what comes next is amazing. The tax collector, Levi, gave a great banquet for him in his house. And there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to the disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" This, again, is kind of a big deal. So he's gone and he's gone to a banquet. He's gotten invited, whatever. He's not going to be rude and say no. But here again, we're dealing with someone who is supposed to be holy as God is holy. We're dealing with someone that is supposed to make decisions that keep him on the right side of God. And to associate with tax collectors and sinners, we're going to come back to that term in just a minute. To associate with tax collectors and sinners takes him way outside of bounds of what a teacher or rabbi or holy man or whatever language you want to put there is supposed to be doing. Any good follower of God would know better than to eat with these and dine with these people. But Jesus of all people should know that he's not supposed to be eating and dining with these people, but he has invited to the table people that don't belong. And it is again and again and again that he invites people to the table that don't belong. Let's talk about this word, sinners. In the English, as we read it, it sounds like, oh, these are bad people. But there's a lot of discussion in the scholarly world. What are we talking about? Are these bad people? Are they sinners because they didn't wash their hands before they went to eat? That's another story at another time. What makes them sinners? So again, the conversation revolves around, is Jesus associating with the right people? As a rabbi, as a holy person, as one that is called to be holy as God is holy, he should be with the religious elite only. He shouldn't have called Levi at all to follow him. He shouldn't have been messing around with anybody that had leprosy. He shouldn't be speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well later. He shouldn't be teaching Mary and Martha in their home. He shouldn't be with these people at all. So there's a few different ways that we read this term sinners. It would be very appropriate to change that word to commoners. So he's eating and drinking with tax collectors and commoners. So what this does, I think, when we understand the fullness of what's going on, because it's not the religious elite, they get different terms. Maybe they are Gentiles. Maybe they are simply not other rabbis and Pharisees. Maybe they are from other places in the community. Maybe they are just simply outsiders to the community. Whatever is going on, this is a broader term than tax collectors and sinners. So we might say it would be a bad thing for you to find me sitting at the pub every few nights with sinners? I don't know. We would have some sort of, I don't know, whatever. I think you could make a case for that. I think it would be very normal for someone to see their pastor at Foamer's Folly, just to name a random place that one might go, and say, he should not be, or she should not be associating with people at Foamer's Folly. He should not be hanging out with those people at the Witchcraft Pub, or wherever it is, right? This is Jesus in his community with the common folk. And it's wrong. It is against all religious and holiness codes. It is not where he is supposed to be, but Jesus is doing something incredibly different than what is expected of him. He is increasing the invitation to the table. And so it is tax collectors, it is sinners, it is commoners, it is those that are unwelcome at every other place in society, sometimes religious society. See, we could have just as easily used the story about Jesus and the children, and that would have been perfect timing. But everywhere you look, Jesus is expanding the table of who is invited and who is welcome to come and sit and be a part of the community of God. And what's beautiful is that Luke tells this story, and what we don't have from the rest of the Gospels is that Luke tells this and then moves into Acts. And the same author is the author of Acts and begins telling the story of the early church and the expanding notion of who is God's people. And it goes from this small religious insiders group to this expansion, and Luke Acts kind of works like this. We have like this broad spectrum of people that Luke begins with in the beginning, and it narrows down into the story of Jesus and these disciples, and then this moment of the cross, and then the story begins expanding again as Acts goes through the story of the church and the expansion of God's message of love, compassion, grace into the world. Not to be limited by the old ways, but to be told and to ever expand who's included at the table. It is a beautiful story that gets missed. we could keep going. I want to do one more. It's one of my favorite stories. It's hard not to do in this conversation. We're going to come back next week. We've got one more to talk about this inclusive nature of Jesus and our role to imitate that. But the story of the Good Samaritan. Now we mostly know it, even outside of the church. It is a common reference in society, the Good Samaritan. What we don't often get out of that story is how other that neighbor is. Say, who is my neighbor is the question. And Jesus answers it with this great parable about the priest walking on the other side of the road, the Levite walking on the other side of the road, people that are supposed to be good and nice people but can't deal with blood because of their religious cleanliness. It would make them unclean, and so they see this blood and and walk on the other side. And then a Samaritan comes by who is literally the enemy, is the one who stops, pulls over, and cares for this gentleman. Puts him on his donkey, carries him to the inn, sets money for him to be taken care of long term. This is somebody who is the ultimate outsider in the story. They are the otherness. So long time ago, there was a group of Hebrew people that are removed from their community. They're taken into exile. Well, there's a faction that stays. They take all the religious elite and take them into exile. Religious, political, wealth, everyone that's of importance, they take into exile. Babylonians, right? And they leave a faction of the community that they see as non-threatening. Often they will move new people in. This is a way of control, power, control, consistency. And so they leave a group in to continue, and they continue to worship. The people in exile continue to worship, and they, over hundreds of years, diverge on their path of theology about who God is and what they're supposed to be doing. One group is the Samaritans. The other group is what becomes the Pharisees, Sadducees, this group of religious elite that maintain the traditions. Not that those are the same things, but you get the point. The Samaritans are both theologically and culturally outsiders in this story. And he's saying, your neighbor is your enemy. It's the one you get along with least. I grew up in the Church of Christ. Down the street, there was a Southern Baptist church. On paper, we were not that far off on a lot of things. But I tell you what, there are a few things, and I didn't hear nothing about the Catholics, which were way different than us. But I heard a whole lot, you can guarantee, about the Baptists that had everything wrong. I look back at those two theologies and I go, I don't get it. Like, they were very, very close. Don't get me wrong, they had most things wrong, but they were very, very close. And that is the kind of thing that we often have this, shall I say, animosity toward a group that is very close, very similar to us, and yet different. And so we define our borders, we define our boundaries even tighter and even harder. And the mere act of anger or frustration about this other group helps set our boundaries. Well, this is what the Samaritans and the Jewish people are doing here. They are setting their boundaries, hard-lined, and the more they can do that, the more strong their own community is. And Jesus says, it is the Samaritan that is your enemy, that is the outsider, that is reaching across the road, taking care of this person, carrying them to the inn. Now, tell me who your neighbor is. Tell me who your neighbor is. Jesus constantly is expanding the notion of insiders and outsiders, constantly expanding who is included and welcome at the table, and who is even more welcome at the table. There's this beautiful moment. We skipped the paragraph earlier in chapter 5. This beautiful moment that I really struggle with what to do. The Pharisees, why are you treating these people this way, or why are you associating with these people? And he says, it's not the well, but the sick that need a doctor. And I go, wait a second. The Pharisees do not seem well by any shape of the imagination. And I don't think that's the point. The point is Jesus is expanding the table of who is welcome, and trying to explain that to the Pharisees in that moment. So we've been working. We started in January with a question, who are we? And we had a whole group of people come through over the next 6 weeks and share some of their stories. We did interviews and we shared stories, and we had diverse theological opinions. We had diverse perspectives on what church is and what we're doing. And we moved into questions about story and understanding who we are and where all these things go and everything like that. And we've talked about mystery and all the questions that come up in a story about God. Broken language, doubts, reassurances, the greatness of God's love and what we're called to be doing. This story, Luke specifically, I don't know why this is such a problem today. Luke specifically calls us to ask the question, how are we going to imitate Jesus in his actions, in his treatment of people, and his welcoming and inclusive nature? Who are we inviting to the table? And then also starting pretty soon after that, we began a study out of our conversation of values and who we are and what we're trying to do. We began a study on LGBTQ and our church. And we told stories. We walked through scripture one by one. We opened up for questions, basically whatever you wanted to ask. We had really great conversations. Like I said, the only time I've ever gotten you to show up to a Bible study was on that topic. And then we concluded with a now what? Today, I get to give you a now what. So we are a community of diverse theological, diverse in our backgrounds, diverse in our family makeup, diverse in everything. And the question at hand is, how do we make that a place that's welcome if we try to put that into words? And we struggled with that for several months. I want to offer, and we're going to do this again next week, I want to offer some language to go on our website. We're not voting on this. I've never asked about anything that goes on our website previously. But I want to offer it to allow you to provide feedback before it goes up. And so, Sharon, can you click the next slide? So we aim to practice a radical hospitality, following in the footsteps of Jesus, who recognized the image of God in every individual. In our diversity, we reflect the image of God. A community of faith, diverse in our age, race, gender, ethnicity, gender identity and expression, diverse ability, sexuality, backgrounds, family configurations, gifts, talents, appearances, and life experiences. We invite the full participation of every member of our community as we explore and share God's love, both in our diversity and through our work.